Just a quick word before the show. In response to last week's episode about chess and Chinese poetry, I received such a long, thoughtful, and thorough response from Ethan, clarifying a lot of the relevant points that arose, that I told him I just wanted to make it available to all of the listeners. So I'm going to include a link to it in the notes to last week's show, as well as in the notes to this week's show. So they will be there for you to check out. It is well worth a read. Now let's get to this week's episode. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So about a week ago, I got an email from Shane McCrae, who asked if I was planning to do an episode on this article. So he sent this article. It was from Psychology Today, and I was horrified. So it sent me down a very long rabbit hole, and I did a lot of reading for this episode. I hope it was worth it, because some of it was very unpleasant, I'll say. This article was called "When Good Becomes Too Good: The Curious Case of AI Poetry." And then the deck is "When AI Poetry Outshines Human Efforts, does art lose its soul or find a new one?" This was posted November 16th, 2024. It's by John Nosta. I found everything about this title, subtitle, deck, and article pretty appalling. I'll read a couple choice excerpts. I'm diving right in because it's quite late, but I do have a little bit of show business. I'm going to have an interview next week for you with Alicia Stallings. I think it's very good, even if I was not great on it due to horrible nerves. So I'm going to have that for you next week. The following week, I'm going to be talking with Alice about a few different things. But then I'm also going to be handing off the show to her for a hiatus. So I'm going to be taking about 6 weeks off to finish revising a novel. I've been working on for a while, and I need some, less interrupted time to dive into that. So Alice has very kindly agreed to take over the show. Now, part of what she'll be putting, so basically she's going to be producing it and programming it and hosting it. 2 of the episodes are episodes I have already recorded, one with Jonathan Farmer, one with Brian Platzer, our Brian, what did I used to call him? Brooklyn sex novelist, Brian Platzer. So those I've already recorded. She's edited them and done Alice intros and outros for them, and she is programming the other 4 weeks, including possibly an Ask Us Anything episode. So the goal for that would be that we'd actually get all 4 of us, Alice, Brian, Cameron, and me, all together. So I may be participating a little bit in the show, but I'm not going to be running it for 6 weeks. She will be on top of that. That's both the main feed and the secret show. So she's already. The thing is, she really just should already be in charge of the show, because I put her on it a week ago, and she's already fully edited, annotated, and titled 2 episodes. And then I went to get a drink with Jonathan, and he was reading a book, and I said, "Oh, what's this?" He said, "Oh, I'm reading it with Alice." I said, "Oh, Alice, you're reading with Alice for what?" And he said, "Oh, for SLEERICKETS." So she's already way more on the ball than I have ever been at any point during the course of this podcast. So you'll be in excellent hands. I did want to mention that both so you know about the transition and because I want to invite your questions. So please do send in questions for Cameron, for Brian, for Alice, for me, or all of the above. Questions, comments, complaints, personal questions are fair game. We might not answer all of them, but they're fair game. Poetry-related questions, show-related questions, gossip-related questions, anything at all. Please do send those in, serious, silly, or otherwise, and we will do our best to answer them entertainingly. So that the hope is that maybe toward the end of that period when Alice is running it, we may get to do a big ask me anything, ask us anything. I think it's still called AMAs, even if they're plural, because why we don't want to invent a new initialism. But that's the hope. For now, though, I will return to this nightmarish article from Psychology Today. Here, yeah, I pulled some excerpts. I probably won't read all of these, but they all chilled me to my core. A new study reveals that AI is not only capable of crafting poetry indistinguishable from human-authored works, but can sometimes surpass it in perceived quality. Thank God that he included that perceived quality. Participants in the study were asked to evaluate poems written by AI alongside those by acclaimed poets such as Sylvia Plath and Emily Dickinson. Their ability to discern the difference was worse than chance. And intriguingly, AI-generated poems often scored higher in rhythm, beauty, and emotional clarity. I was nauseated reading this. The study highlights what the researchers call the more human than human phenomenon. AI-generated poems, while technically less complex, were often mistaken for human creations because of their accessibility and emotional resonance. These poems were clear, rhythmic, and easy to engage with, capturing the immediate attention of readers. Human-authored poems, on the other hand, with their layered metaphors and nuanced themes, were more frequently misidentified as machine-generated. He's already inserting some of his own interpretations, but so that you understand the thrust of this study, there were two parts to it. One part was evaluative and one part was diagnostic. So in one part, they did use the same batch of poems, half by humans and half by AI, written supposedly in the style of those human poets. And the terrifying conclusion of these studies were twofold. One, that the AI poems were consistently preferred. Now, again, like consistently doesn't necessarily mean across the board. It means better than chance, right? Better than half and half, better than 50-50. And then in addition to that, the AI poems passed the Turing test better than human poems. So the Turing test famously is a thought experiment that Alan Turing came up with, whereby one would correspond with a machine, and the point at which one was unable to identify that one was corresponding with a machine was the point at which he said the machine could effectively be considered intelligent. That if you don't know, if you think you're corresponding with a person, then that we might as well call that entity intelligent. Whether or not you buy that criterion, it's a very famous test, and the AI poems did better at that test than the humans did. That is, they were more human than the human poems. That's what they're referring to with the more human than human phenomenon, that people thought these were human poems and they liked them better than the actual human poems. John Nosta goes on to give a little bit more of an analysis. Some of his argument starts to coil back on itself and contradict its earlier parts. Because this is not the main focus of my episode, I'm not going to spend too much time on the way in which he says, hey, AI art, we like AI art because it's simpler, except sometimes it's more complex, and maybe does the complexity and the he says we like it because it's comprehensible and simpler than human art, which is incomprehensible and complex, except sometimes AI art is more complex than human art, and in that way it must be also incomprehensible, and maybe incomprehensibility is not a flaw. Maybe actually we should like the AI art better because it's incomprehensible and complex, which the study says it's not. I mean, he stops knowing what he's talking about. I mean, I think honestly, like, I started to get the impression that this article was written by AI, but there were a couple points it made that I found very troubling. Perfection has its downsides. particularly in art. AI-generated poetry, while polished and precise, again, he's making that assessment, risks feeling sterile. Its flawlessness, again, his word, devoid of the imperfections that give human art its soul. So what he's saying is that imperfections give human art its soul. Part of what draws us to human creativity is its vulnerability, its capacity to surprise, fail, or veer into the unexpected. I'll skip ahead a little bit. The study's findings suggest that we favor accessibility, clarity, and emotional resonance, qualities that align with our need for connection in a fragmented world, but they also challenge us to reconsider the role of ambiguity and complexity in art. Are these qualities essential to creativity, or are they artifacts of human limitations that AI is helping us move beyond? So, like the two-part, so like basically I had like three like gag triggers in this article. One was the idea that AI art was indistinguishable from human art. Two was the idea that the thing that human art, specifically poetry, had going for it was that it was flawed. That basically, like, the errors and imperfections in human art were the good part, right? Like, hey, what makes Jewel all the cuter is her crooked teeth. Like, okay. To me, that's just profoundly depressing. And then the third trigger for me was this idea that AI art excels at accessibility, clarity, and emotional resonance. That's what it does really well. And ambiguity and complexity, it does poorly. That's really what human art has going for it. And so part of why this like really bothers me is that clarity is probably like one of my very chief virtues in poetry. Like one of the virtues I most prize in my own work and in others' work is real clarity. Accessibility is a funny word. People tend to mean different things by it. But I do think hospitality is very important in poetry. And yeah, emotional resonance. I want poems to move me. I want my poems to move readers. And so the idea that like not only was AI writing poetry better than, indistinguishable from human poetry, but that like it was particularly good at these things, suggesting that like it was, the Camerons that would inherit the earth, or maybe like the AI Matthews that would inherit the earth. Like that was like particularly troubling. Like in the sort of the larger tug of war between language for language's sake and language for the sake of communication. Like language for the sake of communication was basically like already completely conquered by AI. That was like, if humans had anything to add, it was the thing that like Cameron most prizes in poetry. And so like writers should all go fuck themselves, but like I especially should go fuck myself. Like that was sort of my fearful reading of this article. So the other thought I had reading it was, of course, repeatedly, okay, show me the poems, where are the poems, show me the poems, let's see the poems, where are the poems, let's see the poems, quote anything from the poems, quote even one line from even one of the poems. Not a line of AI poetry appears in this article, although at the end he does seem to attribute a line to AI. So this is a line I remember rolling around the web a few years ago that indeed does have the ring of Shakespeare, but it's sort of like a slightly deflated line of Shakespeare. John Nosta appears at the end to attribute it to AI. Perhaps the greatest gift AI can offer us is the opportunity to reimagine that question, the question of what it means to be human, to see ourselves anew in the words of a machine. The next line of the essay, in italics, is, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." So the end of this essay is, and perhaps the greatest gift AI can offer us is the opportunity to reimagine that question, to see ourselves anew in the words of a machine. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So I remember hearing this line and thinking like, oh, is that like the web and the tetrameter and the deception. I thought, like, is that from Midsummer? Is that just like not a great couplet, but like a fine couplet from Midsummer? Like I could see that being something Puck says or something Titania says maybe. I mean, I guess Titania gets tricked more than anybody. But then reading this, I thought like, oh God, this is AI poetry? Like AI wrote this? Like is he quoting, is he finally doing the thing I was asking him to do and quoting AI poetry? I think maybe he thinks he was. I don't know. Like maybe he thinks he was. It really seems like he thinks he's quoting AI poetry. He's not. This is Walter Scott. This is from a poem called Marmion, I think. And it again, like it has that sort of, that construction that one might associate with actually poignant lines like, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Those utterances, in addition to having a sort of a satisfying form to them, or like the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Like those, the better part of valor is discretion. These statements all like reveal human perspective in them. Like reveal a kind of a contradiction, a paradox, a tension that exists that is only resolved by the human experience. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. First seems, maybe redundant, maybe just filling out the meter, but also it only sort of has the ring of a paradox. It isn't actually a paradox. When we practice to deceive, again, practice to deceive is a little clumsy, but like fine. Like when we try to deceive other people, we weave a tangled web. Well, that's sort of, yeah, right? Like you're trying to trip somebody up, trap somebody, trick somebody, you weave a tangled web. It's really just saying like, we are like spiders weaving webs when we trick people. It's not actually a contradiction. And so all of which is to say, it has, honestly, like this was written by a human being. It sort of has the ring of AI poetry, as we'll encounter later, because I will share with you some of this poetry. It took me a little looking, but I found it, and I won't quote him. I'll just say I sent a sample of it to Shane in response to his initial email saying like, hey, have you seen this? His response was in all caps. But so I did, before reading the AI poetry, I read the study that John Nosta, or John Nosta's AI helper, was writing about. All right. So this was published in Scientific Reports in November of 2024. I think that's right. Yeah. Published 14th November 2024. The study is called AI-Generated Poetry is Indistinguishable from Human Written Poetry and is Rated More Favorably. It was not short, not fun to read, but and like filled with, basically like the whole abstract was filled with references that made me want to then go down other rabbit holes, pursuing other studies that I was skeptical of in different ways, like AI-generated humor is just as funny as human-generated jokes. Period. Statement. Just flat statement. Unqualified. One footnote for that to one study that was performed. Again, I started to look at that, and then I thought, like, no. Like, I have to focus. Poetry is a particularly difficult literary genre to understand and interpret, especially for non-experts. It incorporates a degree of arbitrariness, since there are no strict or universal rules for what is acceptable or not. And it not only resists commonly acceptable meaning, but also reverses it. Just again, like just treating these these quotations or references to other, like theoretically scientific papers as just like scientific fact, just like proven fact. But again, I tried not to get sidetracked going through this. This was much about this study, as described in this paper, annoyed the bejesus out of me. But they did a more thorough job than many. They had a bigger sample than they might well have. Like half of the major sociological studies that one like learns about in college, if you go back to the original studies, they're like 9 like white 20-year-old male Harvard students that they drew the results from. So they did have this was a sample size of 1,600 people they used, and importantly, they pre-registered their study, meaning that they sort of publicly signed up ahead of time to say, like, here's what we're testing for, here's what we're looking at, here's what we hypothesize. And that's important because in addition to the data colada, Brian and I mentioned on a previous episode, which is this little, basically like a little vigilante group of 3 academics who have blown up a lot of fraudulent sociological data. In addition to like out and out fraud, there've been a lot of sociological studies in the last 25 odd years, the results of which were not based on an initial hypothesis, but rather the experimenters basically like did some tests, looked at a variety of results, sought out a pattern, and then reverse engineered a hypothesis to fit that pattern, which is very bad science and not usually replicable as an experiment. So they did not do that here. They did go ahead and state ahead of time what they were testing for, how they were testing for it, what they thought would happen, and for that, I'm grateful. They don't get an F for science. I have to like be so careful, not careful. I have to be like choosy about what to start to object to. Non-experts in poetry may use different cues and be less familiar with the structural requirements of rhyme and meter than experts in poetry or poetry generation. This is a hint of a colossal blind spot in this study. The biggest problems for non-experts in poetry are that they're not familiar with the structural requirements of rhyme and meter. That's their assumption, which is not, I would say, consistent with my experience. Certainly, if you're somebody who studies poetry today, if you're like the average poetry professor in America, then you don't spend most of your time concerning yourself, or honestly, like probably you spend zero time and spent zero time in grad school thinking about rhyme and meter at all. And in fact, like it is the non-expert in poetry who is far likelier to concern himself with rhyme and meter than the expert in poetry today. So just like, I mean, like they definitely, this was sort of like when you like watch a British TV show and they have an American character say, "Hey now, are you fucking me about?" And you just think like, did they not know any Americans that they could could they not talk to anybody and say like, "Hey, no American has ever said that ever." So it did make me think like these guys truly don't know anybody in their life who has ever read a poem. This was also, I think, to their credit, this was a human out of the loop study. So this is sort of what I think of as like the Kenny Goldsmith factor. So not a small amount of AI writing has been Kenny Goldsmithized, right? So like Kenny Goldsmith would say he took text directly from these, uncreative sources and then repeated it or kind of reproduced it in different forms. But part of his practice, like a standard part of his practice, was, as he put it, massaging the text, right? Which is what got him in so much trouble when he massaged the autopsy report of Michael Brown. So the scientific term for poetry generation that is for poetry that is produced by an AI, but then humans are used to choose the best parts or adjust it or make it more palatable. That's called human in the loop poetry generation, because there's a human involved to kind of oversee the AI. This study used human out of the loop poetry generation. So the way they produce these poems, I'll have a word to say about how they chose the poems, but they picked 10 famous poets Again, I thought a lot of thoughts about how they chose the poets, how they chose the poems from the poets, but the 10 poets they chose, we conducted 2 experiments. We collected 5 poems each from 10 well-known English language poets spanning much of the history of English poetry. So the 10 poets were Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, Samuel Butler, Lord Byron, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, Allen Ginsberg, Sylvia Plath, and Dorothea Lasky. I'll tell you what else shows how out of touch they are with the poetry world is am I mistaken, or is that 10 white people sort of, which is not to say that you couldn't pick 10 famous great, there are some of these are great poets, but it's just the idea that any English department in the country at this point would say hey, let's study 10 poets, let's have them all be white. It's just good job. It reminds me, I don't know, in a way it's sort of endearing. It reminds me of I've been watching a shit ton of chess, which is at this point extremely multi-ethnic, but chess people have never heard of woke. It just hasn't reached them yet. So it's sort of refreshingly just oblivious. It's not even anti-woke. It's just it's just oblivious. But yeah. So I'll get to the selection of poets and poems later. But they chose these 10 poets, and then here's what they did. They used ChatGPT 3.5, and they said, write 5 poems in the style of T.S. Eliot. Write 5 poems in the style of Dorothea Lasky, and so on. And they used the first 5 poems generated. So they did not pick and choose. They just took the first 5 poems generated by ChatGPT 3.5 when they gave it that prompt. That's all they said. They said, write 5 poems in the style of Geoffrey Chaucer. They took those 5 poems. They took the 5 poems they'd chosen from each of these authors. They then gave packets of 10 poems to a bunch of human subjects, and of those packets, they would say this is, the packet would be of all poems in the style of Geoffrey Chaucer, 5 of them in the style of Geoffrey Chaucer because they were written by Geoffrey Chaucer, and then 5 of them in the style of Geoffrey Chaucer as interpreted by ChatGPT 3.5. And these were not labeled, so the subject then had to read them and assess whether these were written by a human or an AI. And then they had some other questions they could answer, are you, how confident are you? Oh, and one of the other findings was that confidence correlated to wrongness. The more confident you were in your answer, the more likely you were to be wrong. Maybe more on that later, because they were very insistent throughout that hey, there were no significant ways there were no factors correlated strongly to human ability to distinguish between AI and human poems. And especially inconsequential was expertise in poetry. Now, they concede that all of the subjects they used were non-experts in poetry. Again, I'm not sure what the selection process was exactly, but conceding that they were all non-experts in poetry, they then invited these participants to articulate their own, to describe their own expertise in poetry. And they said that basically having more expertise in poetry had no effect on whether you were more or less right when you picked these answers. I found very quickly the very first factor that came to mind I identified was very strongly correlated with your ability to choose correctly, by the way, but I'll get to that later. I'm going to focus more on the first essay. The second, the first study. The second study they did. This is when they were asking people to evaluate the quality of the poems, and they asked them to evaluate the quality of the poems. They asked them also to evaluate them according to 7 qualities the way they described the qualities made me lose my mind. Oh yeah, here we go. Overall, our participants reported a low level of experience with poetry. 90.4% of participants reported that they read poetry a few times per year or less. 55.8% described themselves as not very familiar with poetry, and 66.8% described themselves as not familiar at all with their assigned poet. So the poet who wrote the whose name was on the poems they were given in this packet, half of which were written by a robot. They did also I have to give them credit. All of their data, it takes a little digging, but all of their material is available online, and I will have links to it. They make some of it easier to find than other parts, and they make one, I think, like extremely telling choice. They present sample poems from their study, and they present 10 sample poems, one from each of the poets, 5 real poems from 5 of the poets, and 5 AI poems from the 5 other poets. So what they don't show you in the sample poems they provide, and this was the packet I sent to Shane that resulted in the all caps response. What they don't show you in that packet is an AI poem by a poet and a real poem by the same poet. They don't show, you can't compare directly, side by side. So extremely telling, and I think like for a reason neither they nor their best critic quite identifies. None of the effects measuring poetry experience had a significant positive effect on accuracy. I disagree, and I can tell you what the factor is very, very soon. Oh, originality. They said like the one factor where human poems rated higher. Oh yeah, what were the qualities they listed? This is the problem. It's like it's written as a scientific study, so it's not fucking linear. It's like very annoying to read through, and then there is a lot of admittedly like advanced statistical discussion that I can only follow so much. Oh yeah. For our assessment study, we chose 15 qualitative features for participants to rate among those identified by. Wow, that's really awkwardly constructed. These were the 15 qualities they provided. They asked people to rate each poem according to. I think that's what they mean to say. You read a poem. There are 15 qualities. You're supposed to assess it according to each of these 15 qualities. You want to hear the 15 qualities? Here they are. Number 1, overall quality. Sorry. It's not that dumb, but it's just funny as a list. First quality, overall quality. So overall quality, imagery, rhythm, sound, beautiful, inspiring, lyrical, meaningful, moving, original, profound, witty, convey a particular theme, convey a particular mood or emotion, and rhyme. So, I mean, I don't want to give them too hard a time for the non-parallel construction, but it doesn't smack of competence. I also like that they say we chose only qualities that were unambiguously good. Unambiguously good qualities like sound, beautiful. I mean, rhythm. I can't give them that much grief for that, but they don't know what they're fucking talking about. They just don't know what they're talking about. They don't know how to ask questions about what they're talking about because they don't understand it to begin with. Like, they don't need to be poetry experts, but like they didn't even know a poetry expert when they came up with this study. They did predict that humans would be unable to distinguish AI-generated poetry from human-generated poetry. They didn't. They didn't think they thought basically humans would be would be no better than chance. That humans would be right half the time and wrong half the time. That you could basically flip a coin and you would be as accurate as the average human at picking whether a poem was written by AI or not. Turns out people were worse than chance, meaning that they were more likely to guess wrong than to guess at random. Than if they guessed at random. They draw a slightly complex or compound conclusion from these studies that I am I have some questions about. Basically, they say that people like AI poems better. Oh, this is the other part of what they found, was that when in the rating study, they had 3 groups. In one group, they gave people 10 poems, half by a human, half by AI. They said nothing about who wrote the poems, and they asked for an evaluation. That was one group. In another group, they gave them 10 poems, half by AI, half by a human, and they said all of these were written by AI. And they had them assess the poems. And then in the third group, they gave them the same packet, and they said all of these were written by a human. Right? Like they just said, like, these are 10 poems by Lord Byron, instead of these are 10 poems by a robot Lord Byron, or just here are 10 poems. And they found that when people thought a human had written a poem, they rated it more highly. When they thought a robot had written it, they rated it lower. So basically they said, like, humans expect to like human poetry more, but they actually like AI poetry more, and that makes them worse than chance at picking out AI poetry, because they pick out the poetry they like. They assume that the poetry they like is by a human, and they're picking wrong, because AI is better than humans at writing poetry, was their conclusion. It is a little bit more complicated than that, but yeah, part of this I think is very right, and part of it is very wrong. I may read this at some length because it's maybe worth digging into. So why do people prefer AI-generated poems? We propose that people rate AI poems more highly across all metrics, in part because they find AI poems more straightforward. Oh, they said, like, the human poems were rated slightly higher in creativity or originality. I can't remember was that one of their non-parallel qualities? But the difference was basically negligible. That it was like it was like so slightly better that it might as well have been not at all. So why do people prefer AI-generated poems? We propose that people rate AI poems more highly across all metrics, in part because they find AI poems more straightforward. AI-generated poems in our study are generally more accessible than the human-authored poems in our study. In our discrimination study, participants use variations of the phrase "doesn't make sense" for human-authored poems more often than they do for AI-generated poems when explaining their discrimination responses. So when reading human poems, because you could give a little explanation, you could give a little note about what you thought, why you were picking one over the other, why you liked one over the other, and the human poems were more likely to get a note to the effect of "this doesn't make sense." In each of the 5 AI-generated poems used in the assessment study, the subject of the poem is fairly obvious. The Plath-style poem is about sadness. The Whitman-style poem is about the beauty of nature. The Lord Byron-style poem is about a woman who is beautiful and sad, etc. A lot of these poems were just basically paraphrases of existing poems by those poets. Some even went beyond that, which I'll get to. These poems rarely use complex metaphors. By contrast, the human-authored poems are less obvious. T.S. Eliot's The Boston Evening Transcript is a 1915 satire of a now-defunct newspaper that compares the paper's readers to fields of corn and references the 17th century French moralist La Rochefoucauld, a poem Cameron picked out as one to talk about when we did a recent Eliot episode. My note under this line is, "You picked this!" exclamation point. And this is where I just have to say, like, their process for choosing these poets and poems is baffling to me. I mean, they clearly, like, these are 10 poets. I guess some are older, some are newer. They all wrote in English. Charles wrote in Middle English. And they left most of his poems in Middle English when they're read, when they're presented to I think one or two maybe updated slightly to modern English, but they're left in Middle English. So they were giving people Middle English poems. They just picked, these are just 10 famous poets, many of whom are best known for long poems. But in the study, I mean, here, I'll skip ahead a little bit. Like, I wanted to tear my hair out reading this. Poems were collected from mypoeticside.com, an online poetry database. No disrespect to mypoeticside.com, but, like, I've been reading poems online and reading poems, pulling poems online and finding links to poems online for this poetry podcast, like, for years now. I've literally never heard of this website. I mean, there are plenty of great poetry anthologies online. Like the point is just like, so why this? Why any of these choices? And they at no point, they basically, like, they seem to be of the mind that, like linguists like to say that a native speaker cannot make an error in speech, from a linguistics perspective. And they seem to be of the same mind. Like a human, once you're a real human writing poetry, that you're authentically human. And so we don't need to think any further than that. So they pick a bunch of poets, many of whom are best known for their longer works. And then they say, okay, but we can only use short poems. Like all of these poems have to be under a page, often like half a page, which like severely limits your selection for some of these poets. And then they also eliminated the top 10 most popular poems on this website from each poet. So they eliminated Lord Byron's top 10 most popular short poems. They eliminated Eliot's top 10 most popular short poems. And then they gave no indication as to how they chose the 5 that they chose after that. I will get back to that selection because I think their chief critic has a really good point about it. But just to return to their conclusion, the complexity and opacity. So they're talking about the complexity and opacity of human poetry. This complexity and opacity is part of the poem's appeal. The poems reward in-depth study and analysis in a way that the AI-generated poetry may not. Spoiler, does not. But because AI-generated poems do not have such complexity, they are better at unambiguously communicating an image, a mood, an emotion, or a theme to non-expert readers of poetry, who may not have the time or interest for the in-depth analysis demanded by the poetry of human poets. As a result, the more easily understood AI-generated poems are on average preferred by these readers, when in fact it is one of the hallmarks of human poetry that it does not lend itself to such easy and unambiguous interpretation. I don't know why they think that's one of the hallmarks of human poetry. It is one of the hallmarks of contemporary American poetry as understood in the academy for like the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Like it's a bizarrely narrow. I mean, really, like, I think the last time these guys had any encounter with poetry was when they took a class in college. Like, they truly seem to know nothing outside of their vague recollection of their college poetry class. All right. Anything else I want to read directly from this study? Again, I will link to the whole study and all of their materials as well. They asked people. Oh yeah, they also had an evaluation where they asked people to rate to what extent a poem conveyed a specific mood or emotion on a 7-point scale from terribly to extremely well. Participants were asked whether a poem rhymes with the choices no, not at all, yes, but badly, and yes, it rhymes well. Participants were told in the nothing framing condition, then answered a forced choice prompt asking whether they thought the poem was written by a human or generated by blah, 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 blah. Oh, and then following the assessment task, they provided demographic information and indicated their familiarity and interest in poetry. By the way, this is not really like a serious part of the study, but like out of curiosity, I went because one of the options when they, it was like, how familiar are you with poetry? Do you not familiar at all, somewhat familiar, moderately familiar? I think like somewhat familiar and moderately familiar were both choices. I would have been totally baffled. These kind of questionnaires, I am completely stymied by. So I would have gotten lost in the multiple choice section of this study before even getting to any of the poems. But I was really curious about one particular set of respondents. It's very stupid, but I was really curious about there were 13 out of 1,634 respondents. There were 13 who listed themselves there. Again, this was an option. And they chose, I am a professional poet. My assumption when somebody says I'm a professional poet, like that's not what they mean is I'm a poetry professor. Like I have a tenured or tenure track position teaching poetry at a university or college. Like that's what I assume they mean when they say I'm a professional poet. Like, does Amanda Gorman live off her earnings from poetry? Like maybe she does. I mean, really, she probably lives off her earnings as like as a model, and like she like as a, you know, she lives off speaking fees, you know, setting aside any mention of poetry. But like nobody's a professional poet in that sense. But like that was one of the options. So I was really curious about the people who answered, "I'm a professional poet." They scored same as average. They were slightly worse than chance. But they also like. Some of the people who said I'm a professional poet, like one of them said like I teach poetry in a college. Like one of them had that kind of answer. Did very badly, scored like 2 out of 10, like on distinguishing poems. But then some of them said I'm a professional poet. I read poetry. How often do you read poetry? Never. Or like one other said like I'm a professional poet. I read poetry a few times a year. And then many of them listed their occupations as in IT, and their training is all science. And like one of them was, I'm a professional poet. I've never taken a poetry course. I never read poetry. I'm a professional. I was just sort of curious about those people. I did like that one who scored 1 out of 10. Misidentifying an Emily Dickinson poem as being written by AI. The response again, this was 10 poems ostensibly by Emily Dickinson, or like, you know, in the style of Emily. These were all in the style of Emily Dickinson. But her note on this particular poem was, "People don't write like this anymore." People don't write like this anymore, and so this must be written by AI. Like, what? I was very curious about the people who identified themselves as professional poets. One more notable, one of them said it was, what do you feel about poetry? I'm a professional poet. I'm indifferent to poetry was one answer. That person did better than average, but not perfect. Though got dinged for an outrageous case that Porter and Machary make no mention of, which is that, and one reason that I wonder about John Nosta thinking that Walter Scott couplet might have been written by a machine is that it turns out when you ask a machine to write something in the style of a poet, sometimes it will just directly plagiarize that poet. Like, of the poems, and this is a point brought up by, I'm going to get to this criticism of this paper, but of the poem, they were 50 AI poems included in this set. 50 human poems, 50 AI poems. Of those 50 poems, one was completely plagiarized. Like, all of the lines were written by Chaucer, but a few were cut out, and the order was slightly changed in the middle. But like, it was effectively just lines from Chaucer. Or it was all of the lines were from Chaucer, but they were not presented precisely the way Chaucer presented them. Another one completely stole the first line of a poem, Byron's most famous poem. Like one of the AI poems begins, "She walks in beauty like the night," and then just says other stuff. And then another one stole the entire first stanza of Emily Dickinson's poem that begins, "Hope is a thing with feathers." Like the first stanza is the whole first stanza of "Hope is a thing with feathers," and then it's just other stanzas that's saying other stuff. So 3 poems that were just outright plagiarized. And if you identified any of these as written by a human, you were marked wrong. So if you marked the Juana Tapril with the Shora Sota, the Drokta Marcha Persa to the Rota, like those, it wasn't quite the 18 lines, it was like 14 of those 18 lines presented as a poem. If you marked that as, like one guy wrote, the guy who was indifferent to poetry and identified himself as a professional poet, wrote, "This is the beginning of the Canterbury Tales." He marked it as written by Chaucer, and they marked him wrong because that was written by a machine. So like, the results are already like you're talking about marginal results. Like, oh, this was slightly worse than like, if 3 out of 50 poems were plagiarized, and you're marking people who identified them as written by humans as wrong, then like, how do you rely on the results? To say nothing of the 4 poems that were presented by Chaucer in Middle English. Like, just presented in Middle English, which like isn't necessarily comprehensible at all to a modern English speaker. Like, if you have read some Middle English, if you are somebody who reads a lot of books, who's really into this, you can probably decipher it pretty well, but like, you're basically presenting a poem in a different dialect, in a different language, and then saying like, hey, how do you like this? How do you rate this? Who do you think wrote this? So like just just on a statistical basis, like to me, like that fucks up their results like profoundly. That's 7 poems that are not even really ostensibly doing the things they're supposed to be doing in this study. Oh, two statements toward the end, or last page. It is. This is here. I have two statements at the end. One I marked yes, and one I marked no, all caps. So here's the one I marked yes. It is likely that as new generative language models are created, and as AI-generated texts become more prevalent, what sounds human in a poem or other piece of text will change. In particular, it is possible that expectations regarding the qualitative differences between AI-generated text and human-authored text may change over time. That I think is true. It doesn't make me happy, but I think it is probably true that like as AI text becomes more prevalent, as we get more familiar with it, as it proliferates more, our sense of what sounds human and what sounds like AI will change. Like one of the other things that was very apparent reading a lot of the responses is that, and this is again pointed out in the other, well, I'll get to the other paper because he makes a lot of really good objections. The other statement that's on the last page of this study that I marked no was, we show that in contrast to previous studies, people are now unable, this is again, these like flat scientific statements they make. People are now unable to distinguish AI-generated poetry from the poetry of well-known human poets. I don't think they showed that. All right. I have tons of notes, and I'm trying not to just like get totally lost in all the weeds here. Okay. So that was Brian Porter and Edward Mauchery's study, AI-generated poetry is indistinguishable from human-written poetry and is rated more favorably. In response to this, just a week later, not like 6 days later? No, 8 days later. So that was published November 14th. On November 22nd, God bless him, I never heard of this guy, Ernest Davis, who teaches in the Department of Computer Science at New York University. I think he just self-published this. Like, I think he just put this online. He wrote a study, and he got Porter. This is the thing. I have to give Porter and Mauchery credit. Again, they pre-registered their study. They got a big sample size. They put all of their material is available online. You can see all of it, all of their data, all of their survey materials, everything. And they worked with Ernest Davis in writing this brutal takedown of their study. They cooperate, like they provided materials to him. They cooperated with him. They talked with him about it. He thanks them for their help in writing this takedown. So his paper is just titled, ChatGPT's Poetry is Incompetent and Banal. A discussion of Porter and Mauchery, 2024. I will just read a few standout passages. I will argue below that some of the claims made by Porter and Mauchery, such as AI-generated poems are now more human than human, are misleading, as is their title. He then quotes them as saying, it may be noted that most of the participants had little knowledge of poetry. However, in analyzing their data, Porter and Mauchery found that the subjects who reported greater experience did not do better to any measurable degree. The study was featured in, he says like, he's identifying how people have started quoting this study and extrapolating even further from the probably already inflated statements of Porter and Mauchery. And so he sort of wants to put some kind of a stop to this. He pulls out some selection. So again, I've been saying, when I was reading the Nasta article, I kept saying, show me some examples, show me some examples, show me some examples, show me some examples. So here are some examples. I'll do what Davis does. He takes one of these sample poems by Whitman, that is by Whitman. This was used in the study, and then he pairs it directly with one of the AI poems written by Whitman, or written by AI Whitman, that was used in the study. And then he does the same thing with Eliot and Robot Elliot. So here's a short poem by Walt Whitman, the actual Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. So that was the real Whitman. Here is AI Whitman. I will try to read this I'm going to really do my best to read this with a straight face, because I don't want to, I'm just going to try to read this straight. This is AI Whitman, sample poem 1. I sing the song of life, the joyous and the grand, of open fields and forests, of ocean and of land, of cities sprawling wide, with streets that never sleep, and of the simple pleasures that we in secret keep. I sing of all the people, the diverse and the free, who walk along the streets with faces full of glee, of farmers in their fields, who work from dawn till night, and of the humble artisans who labor with delight. I sing of love and beauty, of all that makes us glad, of children's laughter ringing, of lovers who are mad, of friendship's strong embrace and family's loving bond, and of the deeper mysteries that we can only ponder. Or I sing of all that's noble, of courage and of grace. And that is ponder or, not ponder or as an over. That's just O-R. Yeah. I sing of all that's noble, of courage and of grace, of battles fought with honor, of heroes taking place, of triumphs over struggles, of light that conquers night, and of the boundless spirit that forever takes to flight. Oh, how I love this life, this world that's full of wonder, this gift that's always given, and never torn asunder. And though I may depart, my spirit still will roam, forever singing praises to the life that calls me home. I mean, clearly this is not a mimicry of Noiseless Patient Spider, but it's a sort of mimicry of Song of Myself. But Song of Myself, of course, is a long poem, so you couldn't include that in the study, though it is, of course, his best known poem. Here is real T.S. Eliot. Again, no clear indication of how or why they chose these poets or these poems from these poets, except that they are not among the 10 most popular poems by any one of these poets. By the way, Dorothy Lasky is 46. I was assuming this was I think who was I confusing her with? Dorothy. Oh, I was confusing her with Dorothy Lessing, and I thought. I didn't know she wrote poetry. Yeah, Dorothy Lasky's 46 years old. She's just like some lady who writes poetry today. But all right, here's real Eliot. Miss Helen Slingsby was my maiden aunt, and lived in a small house near a fashionable square, cared for by servants to the number of 4. Now, when she died, there was silence in heaven, and silence at the end of her street. The shutters were drawn, and the undertaker wiped his feet. He was aware that this sort of thing had occurred before. The dogs were handsomely provided for, but shortly afterwards the parrot died too. The Dresden clock continued ticking on the mantelpiece, and the footman sat upon the dining table, holding the second housemaid on his knees, who had always been so careful while her mistress lived. Not my favorite poem by Eliot. That's real Eliot. Here's AI Eliot. The clock ticks on with measured beat, as through the night I walk the street, the cities hum a lullaby as dreams and shadows pass me by. Again, this is presumably borrowing, not a borrowing, but a crude imitation of preludes. Here's Plath. Here's real Plath and AI Plath. All right, here's real Plath, Sylvia Plath. Here are 2 pupils whose moons of black transform to cripples all who look. Each lovely lady who peers inside take on the body of a toad. Within these mirrors the world inverts. The fond admirer's burning darts turn back to injure the thrusting hand, and inflame to danger the scarlet wound. I sought my image in the scorching glass, for what fire could damage a witch's face? So I stared in that furnace where beauties char, but found radiant Venus reflected there. Okay, here's AI Plath. The day is gray, the sky is bleak, my heart is heavy, my soul is weak. The world outside is a muffled sound, a lonely place where I am bound. I long for light, for something true, but all I see is a shade of blue. The hope inside me flickers and fades as the darkness claims me in its shades. All right, so Ernest Davis does a little bit of formal survey. He does a little bit of a formal survey of the poems. He says true things. There's one thing that there's a point that he doesn't make, that he doesn't, I think, drive home, that Porter and Mauchery themselves make and seem not to notice. Of the poems written by humans in this selection, 40% rhymed. Like 40% were end rhymed. Of the AI, 40% of the AI poems in this packet, 89% rhymed. like Davis makes a slightly finer point, but like if the only thing you did was you said, hey, I think the rhyming ones were by AI, you would be way better than Chance. You would do way better than Chance. Davis, here's Davis. He makes the point that one of the poems is just directly plagiarized from Chaucer. Of the 49 AI-generated poems, he basically doesn't count that as an AI-generated poem. Correctly so. Correctly, he does not count that, although they counted it as that, as AI-generated when they marked people wrong who identified it as being written by Chaucer. Of the 49 AI-generated poems, all but two, AI Whitman 4 and AI Lasky 4, are in iambic or trochaic meter, alternating blah, 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 blah. Mostly strict, though a few have irregularities. He doesn't know how to scan. I mean, which is fine. He doesn't need to. He's a computer scientist. He does like an amazing job, but he's not really scanning them, but mostly he's pretty right. 39 of the 49 are strictly in pentameter. Again, he doesn't need to be saying strictly, but 39 of the 49 are in pentameter, tetrameter, or trimeter, and 6 more are in a combination of these. There are 2 two-line couplets, 5 Shakespearean sonnets, and the remaining 42 poems are structured as 4-line stanzas. So 42 out of 50 poems were just written in quatrains. All but 6 use either AABB or ABAB rhyme schemes for 4-line stanzas and AA for couplets. So again, they're being told that the AI is being told to write these poems in 10 different styles. It is not writing in a style. Like, it does a slightly more sophisticated job with Shakespeare and Chaucer. Like, I mean, marginally. But like, what it's doing is it's identifying themes. I think Davis actually has a very, very good comparison that he makes later on. I'll finish his verse-craft analysis. There is no significant use of alliteration or assonance. The vocabulary tends to be much easier than in the real poetry. Right, like that's another thing. Like another good key that you were reading a poem by a human was that there was any word you didn't immediately know. Like if there was any word that you had to stretch a little bit for, or you might want to look up, or it might not be immediately one of the like 150 words you use every day, that would guarantee that was not an AI poem. AI poems didn't use any vocabulary that was outside of the immediately accessible. There are no literary or historical allusions in the AI poems. Some further details are given in the appendix. Blah, blah, blah. He talks about a similar experiment that he performed with ChatGPT. The one exception is Shakespeare. ChatGPT's imitations of Shakespeare are all Shakespearean sonnets in form, right? Like they're 3 quatrains in a couplet. Which is pretty much what it was doing anyway, but it mostly wants to write tetrameter quatrains. That's mostly what it wants to write. Here's Davis on the quality of writing of the AI poems. And this, to me, I think is pretty much on the nose. All in all, the AI poems seem like imitations that might have been produced by a supremely untalented poet who had never read any of the poems he was tasked with imitating, but had read a one-sentence summary of what they were like, right? Sylvia Plath wrote sad poems and killed herself. Okay, all right, got it. How about some tetrameter quatrains about gloom and murk and sorrow in her soul? Lord Byron wrote some poems about beauty and heartache. Okay, got it. All right. Well, how about some tetrameter quatrains about unquenchable fires in the breast? A lot of unquenchable fires, a lot of wandering like a dream, a lot of stillness of the night, a lot of repeat. I mean, across all of these different, ostensibly different poetic styles. This is the thing. Like, I didn't read all of them because it's so fucking depressing. But I read through almost all of the poems, and it really produces a feeling very much like the feeling of reading, of like assigning a first poetry assignment in an intro to poetry writing class in a college, and getting back, like, it's the feeling you get when you are teaching an especially bad semester, like a semester where like there's not a wink of talent in the class, and you just get back 25 poems and they're just utter dog shit, and clearly the students didn't care about, like, not like bad because they were trying and they don't have to, like, just like they wrote them with contempt for you. That's the feeling you get reading all of these poems one after the other, and they sound so similar to one another. The Ginsberg poems, as Davis says, like, they sound like a Greenwich Village style guy talking. Like, really, it's just furniture and stated emotion. Again, like, part of the reason that, like, the all of the statements that the AI poetry communicates emotion more clearly than the human poetry, what is meant by that is that the AI poetry announces the emotion it is about. Like, it just says, this is about sadness. I am filled with sadness. So, sorrow is the theme. It doesn't communicate those emotions. It doesn't convey them. It doesn't provoke them. It doesn't simulate them. It doesn't make you feel them as well. It just announces what they are. I just recorded 2+ hours all at once. There's going to be a second half up on the secret show. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to break this right now, but you can go to sleerickets.substack.com to hear the rest. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. Oh, and send in your questions for the AMA, AUA. Send in questions for me, for Cameron, for Brian, for Alice, all of us. We want your questions. Smart questions, dumb questions, long questions, short questions. Send them in. Thank you for listening. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.